Eleanor Hayes, 52 years old, had spent nearly half her life building the empire her husband was now preparing to use to bury her alive. On the top floor of a tower overlooking snow-covered Chicago, Victor pushed the divorce papers toward her and coldly announced that she had exactly one night to disappear from his life. The room was so quiet that Eleanor could clearly hear the wind howling beyond the thick glass. Victor stood beside the marble bar, his gray suit fitted perfectly to the body of a man who looked as though he had just stepped off the cover of an architecture magazine. Behind him were the designs that had once made the entire city praise Victor as a genius. No one knew that many of the first lines on those drawings had been corrected by Eleanor at 2 a.m. After she had finished working her second job, Victor looked at the small suitcase at her feet. He said the penthouse belonged to him, the company belonged to him, the reputation belonged to him, and the $60 million inheritance that had just appeared, naturally, did not include Eleanor either. Then, he set the pen down. Sign it. Just 2 words. Brief, sharp, merciless. At the far end of the room, Celeste, the secretary nearly 30 years younger than Eleanor, pretended to look at her phone, but the smile at the corner of her mouth was impossible to hide. She had already chosen new curtains for the master bedroom and sent kitchen samples to the designer. In Celeste's mind, Eleanor was nothing more than an old possession that would be removed from the home before sunrise. But Eleanor did not cry. She turned through the pages one by one. The dense clauses were written in cold, legal language, enough to make a frightened person sign without understanding what they had just lost. Victor believed her silence meant surrender. His lawyer thought the same. Even the building manager standing outside in the hallway believed that the self-possessed woman, who had once carried the entire family, had finally been crushed by her husband's betrayal. Only Eleanor knew that her heart was no longer breaking. It had already broken weeks earlier, when she discovered that Victor had secretly transferred assets, altered records, and constructed a story claiming that she was the one who had caused the family's money to disappear. The shock had passed. The pain had passed too. What remained was the frightening calm of someone who had seen the entire trap and had still decided to step inside it. She picked up the pen. Celeste held her breath. Victor's lips curled into a faint smile. Eleanor signed. The final stroke of ink had barely dried before Victor immediately pulled the documents toward himself. He did not notice Eleanor looking at a small line near the end of the appendix. Victor's own lawyer had added that line to protect him from old debts. Eleanor stood, put on the black sweater that was worn at the wrists, and pulled her suitcase toward the door. Before leaving, she turned to look at the man who had once promised to grow old beside her. Victor told her not to expect to come back. Eleanor only smiled. She said everything in this room might belong to him, but there was one thing Victor had never understood he owned. Outside, the snow was falling more heavily. Eleanor walked out of the building beneath curious stares, whispered conversations and raised phones, recording the moment the wife of a famous architect was thrown out with a single suitcase. No one knew that the woman they were pitying had just entered a game she had prepared herself. And Victor, raising a glass on the 40th floor, still did not understand that the signature he had just won might be the very thing that brought his entire empire crashing down. 20 years earlier, Victor did not have a marble-lined office, glowing magazine interviews, or anyone calling him an icon of Chicago architecture. Back then, he was only an ambitious young architect, living in a cramped, rented apartment, carrying a portfolio of beautiful designs but lacking enough money to turn any of his ideas into reality. Eleanor was the only person who believed in him. During the day, she managed records for an interior design company. At night, she took on freelance projects, revised drawings, prepared cost estimates, and wrote bid proposals for small clients. Some weeks, she slept only 3 hours a night. Some months, her entire salary disappeared the moment it reached her account because she had to pay credit card debt, rent, and the loans Victor had taken out to pursue architecture competitions that he repeatedly failed to win. Victor always had an explanation. He said the market did not yet understand his vision. He said investors were too conservative. He said everything would change if he could receive just one more opportunity. And Eleanor believed him again. When the bank rejected their next loan application, she put her own name on a high-interest credit agreement so Victor could complete the model for his first hotel project. When he could not afford to hire employees, she taught herself architectural software and edited his drawings at night. When a client suddenly withdrew, Eleanor personally called every partner, convinced them to remain, and saved the company from bankruptcy. Whenever she became exhausted, Victor would hold her and say that one day, the two of them would stand on the highest floor in the city and look down at all the people who had once looked down on them. He promised he would never forget. Eleanor lived on that promise for 2 decades. But when Victor began to succeed, that promise slowly turned into silence. He no longer introduced Eleanor as his partner, he called her only his wife. At lavish parties, he accepted every compliment for projects Eleanor had stayed awake all night to rescue. Whenever someone asked what she had contributed to the company, Victor would usually laugh dismissively and say she was simply good at keeping everything organized. Eleanor heard him. It hurt. But she stayed. She thought it was merely the price of success. Until the morning, Victor received a call from an international law firm. A distant uncle who had lived in Europe for many years and had no children had died. In his will, Victor was named the sole beneficiary of an estate worth $60 million. The inheritance arrived like a golden door opening directly into the world Victor had always desired. Within days, he replaced his car, ordered expensive watches, and began talking about repositioning the brand. He canceled dinner appointments with Eleanor, claiming that he needed to meet with lawyers and financial advisors. But Eleanor soon realized that the name appearing most often in those meetings was not a lawyer's name. It was Celeste. The young secretary began accompanying Victor to private events. She changed his schedule, blocked Eleanor's calls, and gradually appeared in photographs posted across social media. Victor said it was only business. But the way he looked at Celeste revealed everything else. Then an internal file appeared. Inside it, Eleanor was accused of transferring money from the family accounts and concealing several expenses with no clear purpose. Signatures bearing her name appeared beneath transactions she had never seen. Victor's law firm sent her a notice demanding that she sign the divorce agreement within 24 hours, or they would sue her for misappropriating assets. Victor did not simply want to leave Eleanor. He wanted to turn her into a criminal. He wanted the entire upper class to believe that the woman who had rescued him from years of poverty was nothing more than a greedy wife clinging to her husband's fortune. That was how Victor chose to end a marriage that had lasted 20 years. There was no gratitude. There was no guilt. There was only a fabricated accusation, a secretary waiting to take Eleanor's place, and a cruel husband who believed that $60 million had given him the power to erase the past. But Victor did not know that Eleanor had kept every record from the earliest days. Every loan, every power of attorney, every legal entity that had been created to save him from bankruptcy. And among them was one name Victor had completely forgotten. That name was Aura Heritage LLC. 20 years earlier, Eleanor had created the company not to hide assets, but to protect Victor from his own failures. When business debts began piling up and Victor's credit score stood on the verge of collapse, Eleanor formed an independent legal entity in her own name to manage the contracts, loans, and assets that were at risk of being seized by the bank. On paper, she owned 100% of the company. Victor had laughed when he first heard the name Aura Heritage. He said it was nothing more than an empty shell filled with old debts. Later, when the business began to prosper, he never asked about it again. Eleanor never forgot. She kept every certificate of registration, every amendment to the ownership records, and every email exchanged with the accountant. For years, Aura Heritage remained dormant like a room sealed behind a locked door. No one entered. No one cared. Until Victor received the $60 million inheritance. Wanting to avoid high personal taxes and conceal the flow of money from former business partners, Victor instructed his legal team to transfer the beneficial interest in the inheritance to a business entity. Celeste was the one who found the old Aura Heritage records and suggested using the company because it had existed for many years, had a clean transaction history, and had never been investigated. Victor never checked who legally owned it. All he saw was a faster path to controlling the money. 3 days before he threw the divorce papers onto the table, the entire beneficial interest in the inheritance had been transferred into an account managed by Aura Heritage. Victor believed he controlled the company because Eleanor had allowed him to use its accounts for business purposes for many years. But permission to use something was not the same as ownership. Eleanor understood that. On the night she left the penthouse, she did not go to a hotel. She went directly to the office of Arthur Hale, an elderly attorney who had helped her establish Aura Heritage. On his desk lay a copy of the divorce agreement Victor had just signed. The most important clause appeared near the end of the document. At the request of Victor's attorney, Eleanor was released from all responsibility connected to any legal entities she owned. In return, Victor surrendered every management right, representative authority, and right of access to companies registered in Eleanor's name, protecting himself from any potential liability tied to old debts. He had signed without hesitation. Victor thought he was severing the last remaining ties to a poor and unwanted wife. In reality, he had personally closed the door leading to $60 million. 3 weeks later, the divorce hearing took place at the courthouse in downtown Chicago. Victor entered with 3 attorneys, while Celeste followed behind him carrying a new designer handbag. They made no attempt to hide their confidence. Eleanor sat on the opposite side of the courtroom, wearing a simple, dark blue coat. No jewelry, no sign of anxiety. Her calmness irritated Victor, but he told himself it was merely the emptiness of someone who had lost everything. Victor's attorney rose first. He declared that Eleanor had voluntarily surrendered the penthouse, the architectural brand, and every claim related to the inheritance. He emphasized that the agreement had been signed while she was fully aware, in the presence of witnesses and under terms that could not be reversed. Victor smiled faintly. Then Arthur Hale stood. He did not argue over the penthouse. He did not dispute ownership of the brand. He did not request a division of the inheritance. He simply placed 3 documents on the judge's desk. The ownership registration for Aura Heritage, the report confirming the transfer of the $60 million beneficial interest, and the clause surrendering management rights that Victor himself had signed. The entire courtroom fell silent. Victor's attorney snatched up the documents. Celeste leaned down to look. Victor shot to his feet, his face drained of color. He said the money belonged to him. Arthur calmly replied that the money had once belonged to Victor, but after it was transferred into Aura Heritage, it became an asset managed by the company, and that company had only one legal owner, Eleanor Hayes. Victor turned toward his former wife. For the first time in many years, he did not see a weak woman. He saw the person who had built the bridge that allowed him to cross. And she was also the person who had just pulled that bridge away. Victor stood frozen in the middle of the courtroom, his hands clenched so tightly that his knuckles turned white. Only minutes earlier, he had believed Eleanor would leave with nothing. Now he was the one who could not touch a single dollar of the $60 million inheritance. He shouted that Eleanor had deceived him. But the judge calmly asked whether Victor recognized the signature on the agreement. Victor could not deny it. His 3 attorneys lowered their heads and reviewed the documents again. None of them dared to look directly at their client. The clause they had once considered the perfect protection against old debts had become the door that locked Victor outside Aura Heritage. Everything was legal. Every document had been signed voluntarily. There had been no theft, no forged signature, no hidden conspiracy beyond Victor's own greed and arrogance. Eleanor did not stand to celebrate. She remained seated with both hands resting on her old handbag. Inside, she felt none of the fierce triumph that many people might have imagined. There was only a quiet sense of relief, like finally setting down a suitcase she had been carrying for 20 years. When the hearing ended, Victor chased her into the hallway. He said they had once been husband and wife. He reminded her of the difficult years, the nights they had eaten instant noodles together in their tiny apartment, and the promises they had made when neither of them had anything. Eleanor turned around. She asked why Victor only remembered the past when he needed his money back. The question left him silent. Celeste stood several steps away, all confidence gone from her face. Once she realized Victor no longer controlled the inheritance, she immediately called her own attorney. Less than a week later, she left the penthouse, taking the expensive gifts with her and denying that she had ever had a romantic relationship with Victor. The remaining consequences arrived faster than he expected. The tax obligations created by the transfer of the beneficial interest were still recorded as Victor's responsibility. The loans used to renovate the penthouse, purchase luxury cars, and host extravagant events all came due at once. The architectural firm lost 3 major contracts after its partners discovered that Victor had created false records to frame his wife. The penthouse on the 40th floor was repossessed and sold by the bank. The luxury car was seized. Victor's name disappeared from the gatherings once reserved for Chicago's elite. Architecture magazines removed his interviews. The people who had once crowded around to shake his hand now passed him as though they had never known him. Eventually, Victor moved into a small, rented apartment beside a railway line. Every night, the sound of trains grinding over the tracks made the windows tremble. He often sat alone in front of his old designs, seeing his name on every page but unable to forget the woman who had quietly corrected every line. Eleanor did not use the money to build herself a new palace. She left Chicago and moved to a coastal town in the south, where the mornings carried the scent of salt in the wind and afternoon sunlight covered the narrow streets in gold. She bought a simple house overlooking a lighthouse, reopened a design studio under her own name, and established a foundation to support women pushed into financial crisis after divorce. She helped them find attorneys. She taught them how to read contracts. She helped them understand that sacrifice did not mean surrendering complete control of their lives to someone else. Years later, at the Foundation's first scholarship ceremony, Eleanor stood before women who had once been dismissed and underestimated just as she had been. In that moment, she understood that the most intelligent form of revenge was not watching Victor suffer. It was living a life he no longer had the power to destroy. Victor lost everything not because Eleanor was cruel, but because he had dug the hole himself with betrayal, greed, and the habit of abandoning people once they had served their purpose. Eleanor was simply the person who refused to climb into it with him. If you were in Eleanor's position, would you launch a public battle, or would you quietly wait for your opponent to fall into the trap created by their own greed? Share your choice in the comments. Do not forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story of betrayal, karmic consequences, and a life turned completely around.